A young millionaire disguised himself as a taxi driver. He never expected to find love with a passenger. Amelia Martin slammed the gallery door behind her, the cold rain immediately soaking through her thin jacket. Her fists clenched around the rejection letter in her hand. The words, "not commercially viable," burned into her brain. She had poured her soul into those paintings, only to be dismissed like she was some clueless amateur. She needed to get to the diner for her shift, but her legs felt like lead. A taxi cruised by, its yellow paint glinting under the streetlights. She threw her arm up, desperate to escape the storm, and it screeched to a halt. The window rolled down, and the driver leaned out. "Need a ride?" His tone was warm, and his smile didn't match the gritty streets of New York City. Amelia nodded and climbed in, shivering as the car's heat enveloped her. The cab smelled like cedar wood, and everything about it, clean leather seats, a spotless dashboard, felt out of place. She glanced at the driver. He was young, probably around her age, with striking blue eyes and a sharp jawline. His uniform seemed oddly pristine, but she was too drained to care. "Where to?" he asked. 34th and Pine, she murmured, wiping rain from her face. She glanced at him again and noticed his name tag, Jake. He flicked the windshield, wipers on, and pulled into traffic. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice gentle. She let out a bitter laugh. "You could say that. I just got told my art is worthless, and if I don't make it to my shift in 10 minutes, I'll get fired from my second job. So yeah, it's been a banner day." Jake glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Worthless, huh? What makes them the experts?" "They run the gallery," she replied flatly, staring out the window. "They're the experts by default." "Or maybe they just don't see what you see," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Sometimes it takes the right person to notice what others miss." Amelia turned to look at him, momentarily stunned. It wasn't what she expected to hear from a cab driver. "You sound like you've given this pep talk before," Jake chuckled. "Let's just say I've met my fair share of people who gave up too soon. Don't be one of them." His words settled in her chest like a small ember of warmth. She didn't know why, but she felt safe talking to him. "What about you? Ever feel like the world's out to crush you?" "All the time," he said, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. "But sometimes you crush it back." She smiled faintly despite herself. The cab slowed as they reached her destination, a neon-lit diner with peeling paint on the windows. "Thanks," she said, fumbling for cash in her bag. "Don't worry about it," Jake said, waving her off. "Get inside before you catch pneumonia." Amelia hesitated, then nodded, and stepped out into the rain. She was halfway to the door when she realized she had forgotten her sketchpad on the back seat. She spun around, but the cab was already pulling away, its taillights disappearing into the city. Jake turned onto a quiet street, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He couldn't stop thinking about her. The fire in her eyes, the way her voice cracked when she talked about her art. She didn't even know how captivating she was. He glanced at the passenger seat where her sketchpad rested. He should drop it off at the Lost and Found. But something stopped him. He flipped it open, curiosity getting the best of him, and froze. The drawings were extraordinary, raw, emotional, and alive in a way he couldn't describe. They were unlike anything he'd seen in the art his socialite friends purchased for their penthouses. He could see her soul in every stroke of charcoal. Jake leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. He was supposed to be lying low, blending in as an ordinary cab driver while he figured out how to handle the fortune he'd inherited. But something about Amelia had struck a chord deep within him. She was different. The next morning, he made a decision. He wasn't going to leave this to chance. He would return the sketchpad himself. Amelia wiped a smudge of ketchup off her apron as the diner bell jingled, signaling a new customer. She didn't look up at first, too busy refilling the coffee pot. "Excuse me," a familiar voice said, and her head snapped up. Jake stood there, holding her sketchpad. He was still in his cab driver uniform, but somehow he looked polished, like he didn't really belong in this world of fluorescent lights and sticky counters. "You left this," he said, holding it out to her, her cheeks flushed. "Oh my God, I didn't even realize. Thank you so much." "No problem," he said, his smile disarming. "I figured it was important." "It is," she admitted, hugging it to her chest. "I don't know what I'd do if I lost this." Jake hesitated, then glanced at the clock on the wall. "I don't want to take up your time, but how about I give you a ride home after your shift? No charge. Call it an apology for holding on to it overnight." Amelia's brow furrowed. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said simply. "But I want to." For a moment, she considered saying no. But something in his eyes stopped her. They weren't just kind, they were sincere. "Okay," she said softly. "Thanks." Jake nodded, his smile widening. "I'll wait outside." As he walked out the door, Amelia watched him go, her heart fluttering in a way she didn't quite understand. She had no idea that the man offering her a free ride was one of the wealthiest young men in the city. And Jake, well, he was beginning to realize just how much he wanted to keep it that way, at least for now. The ride home was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Amelia clutched her sketchpad like a lifeline, her fingers absently tracing the worn edges of its cover. Jake, glancing at her from the corner of his eye, broke the silence. "So, what kind of art do you make?" he asked, his voice casual but tinged with genuine curiosity. Amelia hesitated, unsure how to explain her work to someone who might not understand. "Mostly paintings. Abstract, I guess. Some people think it's too messy." Jake frowned slightly. "Messy how?" She shrugged. "Too much emotion, too raw. Not the kind of thing that fits neatly in a fancy living room." Jake smiled to himself. He didn't need to tell her he'd already seen her work. Her style wasn't messy. It was alive. "Sounds like the kind of art worth looking at," he said instead. Amelia glanced at him, her expression softening. "You're surprisingly supportive for a total stranger." "Maybe I'm not a total stranger," Jake teased lightly, keeping his eyes on the road. "Maybe I'm just someone who knows talent when he sees it." She let out a small laugh, but there was a tinge of vulnerability in her voice when she replied, "Sometimes I think I'll never be good enough. But then I remember why I started painting in the first place." Jake glanced at her, his interest piqued. "Why did you?" Her gaze turned wistful as she stared out the window. "Because it makes me feel alive, like I'm meant to do it, even if no one else sees what I see." Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't say it aloud, but he saw it. Her passion, her fire. It was undeniable. And it was exactly why he couldn't let her slip away. As they pulled up to her apartment building, Amelia's embarrassment crept in. Her place wasn't much to look at. A weathered brick walk-up with a flickering porch light. She fidgeted with her seatbelt, suddenly self-conscious. "Thanks for the ride," she said quickly, reaching for the door handle. "Wait," Jake said, stopping her. "Let me walk you up." Amelia blinked, surprised. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said with a small smile. "But I want to." She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. But it's not much, just so you know." They climbed the narrow staircase to her floor, the air smelling faintly of paint and coffee. Amelia unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing a small but vibrant space. Canvases leaned against every available surface, some finished, others in various states of completion. Paint-splattered furniture and cluttered bookshelves gave the room a lived-in charm, and a faint scent of turpentine lingered in the air. Jake stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. It was a far cry from the polished perfection of his penthouse, but there was something about it. Something real, unfiltered, and entirely Amelia. "Sorry, it's a bit of a mess," she said, setting her sketchpad on the kitchen counter. Jake shook his head. "It's incredible." She raised an eyebrow. "You're easily impressed." "No," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not." Amelia felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. She busied herself with the coffee pot, her hands trembling, slightly as she poured. "Coffee." "Sure," Jake said, leaning against the counter. "So, what's the story with all this?" He gestured to the canvases around the room. Amelia handed him a mug, her expression thoughtful. Each one's a little piece of me, I guess. Some are moments I've lived, others are things I've felt but couldn't put into words. Jake studied her, captivated by the way her eyes lit up as she spoke. And you're afraid no one will see their worth? She shrugged again, but this time her smile was tinged with sadness. Rejection does that to you. After a while, you start to wonder if you're just fooling yourself. Jake set the mug down, his expression serious. You're not fooling yourself. Anyone who can't see what you have to offer, they're the fool. Amelia blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. You really don't know me, she said finally, her voice soft. But thank you. Jake wanted to tell her he wished he could know her, deeply and fully. But he held back. Anytime, he said instead. As the evening wore on, their conversation drifted to lighter topics. Favorite books, worst jobs, the strange quirks of New York City. Jake found himself laughing more than he had in months, and Amelia felt a warmth she hadn't realized she was missing. At one point she jokingly called him her most supportive stranger, and Jake chuckled, though the truth of her words struck a chord he wasn't ready to confront. When the clock chimed past midnight, Jake finally stood, reluctant, to leave. I should let you get some rest, he said, his voice low. Amelia walked him to the door, her heart unexpectedly heavy. Thanks for everything. I owe you one. Jake smiled, his hand lingering on the doorknob. You don't owe me anything, Amelia. As he stepped into the hallway, he turned back, a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. Good night. Good night, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment. Her mind swirled with thoughts of the enigmatic cab driver who had somehow seen her in a way no one else had. Jake descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet building. He knew he was already in too deep. He had to tell her the truth. Eventually, but not yet. Not tonight. For now, he just wanted to be the man who made her smile. The next morning, Amelia arrived at the diner 10 minutes early, the smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee greeting her as she tied on her apron. She couldn't shake the lingering warmth from last night. The way Jake had made her laugh. How he'd looked at her art as though it meant something. It had been a long time since anyone had made her feel truly seen. She was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled. Glancing up, she froze. Jake stepped inside, his cab driver uniform as crisp as before, his smile easy and familiar. Morning, he greeted, sliding into a booth by the window. Do you serve anything that doesn't come with a side of grease? Amelia smirked, grabbing the coffee pot. You keep showing up, you'll be swimming in grease before long. Maybe it's not the food I'm here for, Jake said playfully, his eyes locking with hers. Her heart stuttered for a moment, but she forced herself to stay composed. Well, if you're looking for gourmet, you've come to the wrong place. Good. Thing I'm not picky, he replied, leaning back in the booth. Surprise me. As she poured his coffee, Amelia couldn't help but notice the way he fit so naturally into the chaos of the diner, even though something about him seemed slightly out of place. He was too polished, too comfortable, like he was playing a role, but she pushed the thought aside, grateful for his presence. Jake became a regular after that, showing up almost every day during her shifts. He'd sit in the same booth, order whatever special was on the menu, and always leave a generous tip, though never so much as to raise eyebrows. The other waitresses teased Amelia about her mystery admirer, but she waved them off, pretending it wasn't a big deal. In truth, she looked forward to his visits more than she wanted to admit. They talked about everything: art, books, music, dreams. Jake listened in a way few people did, his attention unwavering, his questions thoughtful. He never pressed her about her struggles, but she found herself opening up to him anyway. Afternoon, as they sat in their usual rhythm of conversation, Amelia mentioned a gallery event she'd been invited to. It's nothing fancy, she said, trying to downplay it. Just a small showcase for local artists. I'm not even sure why they asked me. Probably to fill space, Jake frowned. You don't give yourself enough credit, she shrugged, fiddling with the edge of her apron. It's just... I've been to these kinds of things before. The people who show up. They're not like me. They're wealthy, pretentious, and they talk about art like it's an investment instead of something real. It's hard to feel like I belong. Jake's chest tightened. He took a sip of his coffee to hide his discomfort. Not everyone with money is like that, he said carefully. Amelia snorted. Maybe, but most of them couldn't care less about someone like me. They don't understand what it's like to struggle, to feel invisible. Jake felt the weight of her words, the truth in them, and the sting of knowing she'd lump him into that category if she ever found out who he really was. Maybe you're wrong, he said softly. Maybe the right person just hasn't noticed. Yet. She tilted her head, studying him. You're awfully optimistic for someone who drives a cab in New York. Jake laughed, though it felt hollow. Sometimes you have to be. Otherwise, this city will eat you alive. The night of the gallery event arrived, and Jake found himself pacing his penthouse, his tie undone and his nerves frayed. He'd called in a favor from his assistant earlier that day, instructing her to attend the event and anonymously purchase one of Amelia's paintings. He wanted to boost her confidence, to show her that someone valued her work, without revealing his hand. The plan was simple. His assistant would make the purchase, and he'd stay in the background. But as the evening wore on, Jake couldn't resist the pull to see her. So, he slipped on a tailored suit and arrived at the gallery just as the event was in full swing. He spotted Amelia almost immediately. She stood near one of her paintings, a glass of water in her hand, her posture stiff. She looked stunning, her simple black dress accentuating her natural beauty. But there was a vulnerability in her eyes that made his chest ache. He stayed in the shadows, watching as a woman approached Amelia and handed her a slip of paper. Amelia's eyes widened as she read it, her hand flying to her mouth. Jake knew what it was. The confirmation of the sale. His assistant had followed through. Amelia turned to one of the gallery staff, her voice trembling with disbelief. Someone bought it? For that much? The staff member nodded. Yes, it was a very generous offer. You should be proud. Amelia blinked rapidly, tears welling in her eyes. For a moment she looked around the room as if searching for the buyer. But Jake kept his distance. This was her moment, and he didn't want to take it from her. Later, as the event wound down, Jake waited outside in his cab. When Amelia emerged, her face glowing with a mixture of joy and disbelief, he rolled down the window. Need a ride? She laughed, climbing into the passenger seat. Do you just hang around every gallery in the city, waiting to pick people up? Only the ones that matter, he said, his tone light but his meaning deeper. As they drove through the city, the atmosphere between them shifted. The soft hum of the radio filled the silence, and the glow of the streetlights danced across Amelia's face. She leaned her head against the window, her voice quiet. Whoever bought that painting, they saw something in me. For the first time I feel like maybe I'm not wasting my time. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel. You were never wasting your time, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You just needed the right person to notice. She turned. To him, her eyes searching his face. I don't know how you do it, she said softly. Make me believe in myself when I can't. Jake swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the road. Maybe I see what you see. Their connection crackled in the air between them, unspoken, but undeniable. Jake pulled up in front of her building, the cab idling as they lingered. Amelia leaned toward him slightly, her lips parting as if to say something. But before she could, her neighbor's voice called out from the stoop. Amelia! Is that you? You left your light on upstairs. The moment shattered, and Amelia pulled back, her cheeks flushing. Thanks for the ride, she said quickly, opening the door. Jake watched her go, his heart heavy with the weight of what he couldn't say. As she disappeared inside, he reached into the glove compartment for his phone, and froze. His watch, the one he'd forgotten to take off earlier, gleamed under the dim cab light. It was a custom piece, one that screamed wealth and exclusivity. He shoved it deeper into the glove compartment, his pulse racing. He couldn't keep this up forever. One day, Amelia would know the truth, and when that day came, he wasn't sure if she'd ever forgive him. The morning sunlight streamed through the diner's front windows, catching Amelia's eye as she bustled behind the counter. It had been 2 days since the gallery event, and her emotions still felt like a whirlwind. Every time she thought about the fact that someone had bought her painting for such a staggering amount, her chest tightened with disbelief. And a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn around. She glanced at the door, half expecting Jake to walk in with his easy smile and teasing remarks. He hadn't shown up since dropping her off the night of the event, and she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had shifted between them. The way he had looked at her during the drive home, the tension in his shoulders, it was as if he had been holding something back. Shaking the thought away, Amelia focused on refilling coffee cups and taking orders. The diner was unusually busy that morning, and she barely had time to stop and catch her breath. It wasn't until her break that she finally sat down at one of the corner booths, flipping through a tattered magazine someone had left behind. Her eyes skimmed the glossy pages until they landed on a photo that made her freeze. She blinked, her heart lurching in disbelief. There, staring back at her, was Jake. Except it wasn't the Jake she knew. In the photo, he wore a sharp-tailored suit, his expression confident and commanding. The headline read, "Philanthropist and millionaire Jake Caldwell expands his legacy with new art initiative." Amelia's stomach churned as she read the article. Words like inheritance, luxury, and investment mogul leapt off the page. The man she'd spent hours talking to, laughing with, trusting. He wasn't a cab driver at all. He was one of the very people she had vented about, the kind of person who didn't understand struggle, who lived in a world far removed from hers. Her hands trembled as she closed the magazine, her appetite gone. How could he have lied to her? All those conversations, all those moments. They felt tainted now, like they had been part of some elaborate charade. Before she could stop herself, she grabbed her phone and dialed his number. It rang twice before he picked up. "Amelia," Jake said, his voice warm and familiar. "I was just about to—" "Don't," she cut him off, her voice shaking. "Don't act like everything's fine. I know the truth, Jake." There was a long pause on the other end. "Amelia, I can explain," he said carefully. "Can we meet and talk about this?" "Explain what?" she snapped, her anger boiling over. "That you've been lying to me this whole time? Pretending to be someone you're not? Do you have any idea how humiliating this feels?" "I wasn't pretending," Jake said, his voice pleading. You just what?" she interrupted. "You didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth? Or you thought I wouldn't? Want to get to know you if I knew you were rich?" "That's not it," Jake said desperately. "I wanted you to know me, Amelia. The real me. Not the guy in that article, not the bank account or the last name. Just me." Amelia's chest ached at the raw sincerity in his voice, but the betrayal still stung too deeply. "You don't get it, Jake," she said, her voice quieter now. "I don't care about your money. I care about the fact that you lied to me. How am I supposed to trust anything you've said?" "Please," Jake said, his voice breaking slightly. "Let me explain everything in person. Just give me a chance." Amelia closed her eyes, the weight of her emotions pressing down on her. "I can't do this right now," she said finally. "I need time." Without waiting for his response, she hung up and buried her face in her hands. The warmth Jake had brought into her life felt like it had turned into a cold, hollow ache. Jake stood in the middle of his penthouse, the phone still clutched in his hand. His heart felt like it was being ripped apart. He had known this moment would come eventually, but he hadn't expected it to hurt this much. He had spent his entire life being judged for his wealth. People either wanted something from him or resented him for what he had. But Amelia had been different. She had treated him like a person, not a paycheck, and he had clung to that feeling like a lifeline. Now, he realized, he had made a mess of everything. Pacing the room, Jake racked his brain for a way to fix this. He couldn't let her walk away, not without showing her how much she meant to him. Suddenly, an idea struck him. It was bold, maybe even reckless, but it was the only way he could think to make her understand. Grabbing his phone, Jake made a series of calls, his determination growing with each one. By the time he was finished, his plan was in motion. 3 days later, Amelia was walking home from her shift at the diner when she noticed something unusual. A sleek black car idled at the curb outside her building, and a well-dressed woman stepped out holding an envelope. "Miss Martin?" the woman asked. Amelia hesitated. "Yes?" The woman handed her the envelope with a small smile. "This is for you." Before Amelia could ask any questions, the woman climbed back into the car and disappeared down the street. Confused, Amelia opened the envelope and found an elegantly written note inside. It read, "Amelia, I know I've hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I believe in you, in your art, and in the way you see the world. Please, give me one last chance to show you how much you mean to me. Tonight, 8 p.m., the rooftop garden at the Astoria Hotel." Amelia's hands shook as she read the note. Her first instinct was to crumple it up and throw it away. But something stopped her. Curiosity? Hope? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that she couldn't ignore the pull in her chest, the small voice in her head telling her to go. That evening, Amelia stepped out of an elevator and onto the rooftop of the Astoria Hotel. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight before her. The garden was transformed into something out of a dream. Twinkling lights hung from trellises, casting a warm glow over the space. Her paintings, were displayed on easels throughout the garden, each one lit like a masterpiece in a professional gallery. Jake stood in the center of it all, his hands stuffed nervously in his pockets. He turned as she approached, his expression a mix of hope and vulnerability. "Amelia," he said softly, taking a step toward her. "You came." She looked around, her heart pounding. "What is all this?" "It's you," Jake said, his voice filled with emotion. "Your talent, your passion, everything that makes you extraordinary. I wanted you to see what I see." Amelia's throat tightened as she took in the scene. "Why, Jake?" she whispered. "Why go through all of this?" "Because I love you," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was scared. Scared that you'd only see the money, not me. But you've always seen me, Amelia, and I need you to know that I see you too." Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped closer to him. "I don't care about your money, Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "I care about the fact that you didn't trust me enough to tell me." "I know," Jake said, his voice breaking. "I know I messed up, but I'm here now, and I'm not giving up on us." Amelia stared at him, her walls crumbling as the depth of his words sank in. She realized in that moment that she was just as scared as he had been. Scared of letting someone in, of risking her heart. But looking into his eyes, she knew the risk was worth it. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. "Don't mess this up again," she said softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. Jake pulled her into his arms, his relief palpable. "I won't," he whispered. "I swear." As they stood there, wrapped in each other, the city skyline sparkled around them. A soft melody drifted through the garden, and Jake held out his hand. "Dance with me?" Amelia smiled through her tears. "Under one condition. Anything. Promise me you'll never lie to me again." Jake cupped her face, his eyes filled with love.